Welcome to a new edition of Pioneer Valley Life. I'm your host, James Sullivan. Today, my guest is Northampton resident Michael Ford. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Good. Michael, you've lived in the Pioneer Valley, I think, since about 1973?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
About 10 years shorter than me, but we've seen a lot of changes in the last 50, 60 years.
Absolutely.
I know you were born and raised in Chicago.
Yes.
But could you tell us a little bit about maybe some of your family history?
Sure. I was born in the south side of Chicago, as James said, and it is and was a pretty well-known area. Historically, it was one of the major black settlements as the migration from the south increased. It also became known as sort of the home of the Chicago blues. Lots of blues performers lived and performed in that area. I went to public school, and the public schools were really important in that they had lots of folks who were very conscious of civil rights issues and racial segregation. The teachers were essentially all black in my public schools. And so we had traditional lessons, but they also added to what you might have thought would be the normal curriculum. We had history that included learning about folks. I knew who Paul Robeson was and all kinds of things of that sort. So the high school was really important. And as a result of that, it led to, I think, sort of interesting careers that a number of my classmates and others who went to the school embarked on. So after high school, I went to a college in Illinois, southwest of Chicago, Knox College, where I majored in political science, and partly that was related to learning about politics and knowing some of the people who were involved in it as I grew up on the south side of Chicago. That was a real experience in that, I guess as was common in those days, this was a small liberal arts college, about 1,200 students. There were 7 or 8 of us who were black, and that was it. And you learned you're not supposed to hang out with your folks who share your ethnicity. So it was kind of a real learning experience for me. Simple things like foods I'd never heard of that were served in the dining commons, and all kinds of curricular kinds of knowledge. I became focused on Africa even as a young undergraduate. It just was fascinating to me. And so when I graduated with my BA, I had a real sort of history of learning about and thinking about and talking about Africa. And Peace Corps had started a year or two before I graduated. So I decided I wanted to actually go to Africa. And what I did was I applied, hoping I'd get a post in West Africa, which is, what you learned about mostly. But there wasn't one, so I ended up in East Africa, which was really unusual. But it was Africa. I learned an enormous amount. It was just a life-shaping experience in many ways. So after that, I came back and did graduate work at Northwestern University, which had a stellar African Studies program. And so that really set me on my way to becoming a teacher administrator with that kind of background. And so that's what shaped my life and led me to eventually coming to the Pioneer Valley.
So when you came in 1973, what was your first position here?
I was on the faculty at UMass in political science, and it was one heck of a time. It just, the university had decided to really build up its faculty, particularly social sciences. For example, they had a renowned Marxist scholar come in to teach economics and built the department in such a way that it was one of the, I suspect, maybe only economics departments that was heavily Marxist in its orientation. Political science wasn't quite that radical, but again, they added really interesting people. The social sciences generally did, because the university was building in that era. So I started as a young, relatively young assistant professor teaching, and I was there, I guess, the full 6 years. But what happened, it was a great time. I had just a wonderful set of experiences and students, one or two of whom I still know. One student I'll mention, who was a graduate student, is now a world-famous author. Walter Mosley was in one of my classes. I started doing administrative work, and I became director of a program at the university called BDIC, which is Bachelor's Degree with Individualized Concentration. So students who were interested and who qualified, they were able to work with a committee and set up an individually designed concentration. It didn't just have to be, majoring in English or history. It was personally designed with the support and mentorship of faculty. So doing that, directing that, and having a hell of a lot of fun doing it, I guess came to the notice of people at Hampshire College. And I would guess that the center of Hampshire's focal curriculum was the individualized study programs that every student experienced. So they decided that I was sort of interesting. They didn't have a dean of students. So I was recruited, and I became the first dean of students at Hampshire College. I think I went there in 1978 and stayed there teaching and being an administrator until I retired 13, 14 years ago. So that was my career.
Yeah. No, so that's, as an academic, I'd say your credentials are quite impressive.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed the teaching. I enjoyed the learning. So it was just a hell of a ride.
So you were probably at UMass at the same time. I know they brought a lot of jazz musicians.
Oh, yes.
To be on the faculty there. Max Roach, Archie Shepp, other people.
Yes. I was there when the African American Studies program department was founded. Yeah, some really amazing people, Sid Kaplan and Mike Thelwell. And once it got founded, among the first folks to be hired were some of these jazz musicians. Max Roach, as you mentioned, Archie Shepp, just Reggie Workman. It was amazing. Just amazing.
And a lot of people, I didn't know this, but I mean, James Baldwin was associated with UMass at one time.
James Baldwin was a faculty member. There used to be this program, the 5 colleges, Hampshire, Mount Holyoke, Amherst, Smith, and UMass, they created a kind of really impressive consortium. They did all kinds of joint programs. They, at one point, would hire a 5-college professor, and that professor had a 3, 4, 5-year contract. So Baldwin was first hired as a 5-college professor, and he was housed at Hampshire and then I think maybe a little bit at Mount Holyoke. But he was impressive enough, and the other institutions were interested enough that UMass then hired him after that, and he became a faculty member at UMass. He had a strong, strong presence, as you can imagine. And there were a number of folks I can recall who worked with him and were just bowled over by his intelligence, by his spirit. There were a number of others too. Sonia Sanchez, who's relatively well known, and Julius Lester. He was a faculty member there, and and a fair number of others.
Yeah.
And W.E.B. Du Bois' wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois, was on the faculty there. Yeah, she was an interesting woman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I wanted to discuss about life in the Pioneer Valley, and from your perspective as a black man. I'm sure today it's obviously it's much different for a black person who lives in Springfield than someone who might live in Amherst or Northampton.
Yeah.
That's just the nature of the valley and the way
Absolutely.
things happen. But I mean, I imagine when you first came in '73, what did you run into?
Well, that's a really good question. Takes me back. One of the clearest things was, when my wife and I started looking for housing, it became clear to us that there was real segregation shaping patterns of residence, even in Amherst. I remember being advised by a faculty member in sociology who was black. There were certain neighborhoods that I just wasn't going to be able to get into, and he was right. I had a really good realtor, Northampton-based woman, and she confirmed too that there were neighborhoods in Northampton where I wouldn't be welcome. And so she went out of her way to guide me to places and even speak to the neighbors, potential neighbors, just to get a feel about what it was going to be like. And quite coincidentally, I think, I ended up living on the same street where she had her home in Northampton on Columbus Avenue. And that was a shaping experience. It gave me a sense of what the valley was like that I just hadn't expected. Over the years, there have been other instances, I have run into situations where you hear this sort of apocryphal stuff about black folks being followed around in stores, and I had that experience. I've had one or two experiences of being stopped by police, not so much in Northampton, but I remember in Amherst I was looking for a number on a mailbox because I was looking for an address, and I got stopped, and was asked what I was looking for and so forth. So there have been those instances, not overwhelming, not like Mississippi or even Chicago, but you didn't forget that you were black living here,
Yeah. No, I remember, I was an undergraduate at UMass in the '60s, and Amherst, you got to know a little bit about the town. But I remember there were a few black families in Amherst at the
Absolutely.
time, who had been there for quite a while.
Yeah.
And they weren't necessarily associated with the universities or the colleges, but they were residents of the town.
That's right.
Business people, whatever.
Yeah.
I think the other thing, that you had mentioned to me that was an impact is that you have an interracial family.
Yes.
And I imagine you had said that, you and your wife did some research about where you might want to live or be able to live,
Yeah.
and that led to a bit about you considering this area.
Right. We got together in 1967, which was only a couple of years after the passage of the Civil Rights Bill.
Yeah.
So it was the early days in terms of the changes that were occurring in this country. And interracial couples weren't welcome in lots of places, To tell you the truth, there are black communities I could have lived in comfortably, but there were also attitudes among some black folks where I wouldn't have been as welcome as I would have liked. And certainly there were white communities where it just would have been really hard and unpleasant. So we looked at housing, as I mentioned, and found that there were places where we just would not have been easily accepted or well treated. but ended up settling in Northampton, and our neighbors, the immediate neighbors were reasonable and friendly people, but we were aware that there were voices in the town. One of the garage mechanics who was well known became a George Wallace supporter, and that kind of thing was not uncommon. So there were experiences. A couple of times, I remember once my daughter was getting on a school bus going to the primary school, and one of the kids called her a nigger. Now, I will say that that got reported, and the kids' parents were informed, and the parents were deeply apologetic. But, you didn't forget that the family was interracial and so forth. And then what made it particularly kind of interesting was that my wife, who was white, became the mayor of Northampton.
Right.
And that was a real trip. It's just an unusual set of circumstances. And, this conversation now leading me to remember, there was a period when there were rumors about us, and the rumors were prevalent enough that some friends called to ask if it was true. Among the rumors was that we were splitting up, and that the lesbian influence was trying to grab my wife, and it was insane stuff. Again, this was sort of early on, but things did change. Things began to change, and as more and more, I guess you'd label them progressive folks, liberal folks, moved into Northampton, you could see the shifts, and they became paramount in terms of the nature of the city, and the people who were elected to the boards and to the school committees increasingly were progressive folk who decried any kind of racism and stuff of that sort. But it for a noticeable period, it was very clear that race, ethnicity, gender identity, all those things were present in the minds of folk. It got better, there's no question. And it is, I'm sure, just completely different now than when, in the early 60s.
Yeah.
So having gone through that change, I appreciate it. And it gives me a kind of lens, as I'm sure you're aware too, of the national politics and what race is coming to mean, and the this and the that. And I've really appreciated the sort of leadership and thoughtfulness of people in this community who've spoken up and who stand up. So that the 50-year period has seen some remarkable change, and my kids would be comfortable here, and there are other interracial. Still, there's not a heavy African American demographic presence here, much more in Amherst because of UMass, but I don't hear folks being unwelcome. Human beings are still human beings. I'm sure there are people with preferences and so forth, but they don't get mouthed and they don't get acted on in the ways that they used to be so common.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think over, there's been a lot of discussion over, affirmative action. And it was, over time, if you were spent time here, you would notice that there were more African-American students at the local colleges than there ever had been.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the fact, with the 5-college program allowing you to take classes anywhere, with the bus system in place, it was, I'm sure, a much different experience for those students, and being able to come to these colleges in this area.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure they've gone on to do many great things because of the fact they got an opportunity in this area.
No, you're right.
Yeah. And it's, in a way that's unfortunate because, you've still got a lot of, like we mentioned, it's much different living a black life in Springfield and Holyoke than it is in Amherst or Northampton. Do you think Amherst and Northampton people of any, I don't know what if African Americans or LGBTQ people, do you feel this is more of an not only accepting but insulating area?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Some folks I know of, and I tried to be part of this, have tried to be real mindful of populations in Holyoke and in Springfield. And one of the things, we had a terrific college president at Hampshire, Gregory Prince, and he worked with some folks whom he got to know in Springfield, some African-American community leaders, some well-known people, and started a program 35, 40 years ago, the Baldwin Scholars. And basically, these were students from Springfield who were part of a program that if they were selected, if they did the necessary work and qualified, they then got entry to Hampshire and later some other colleges, and the entry was for a year. And if they were able to keep up their performance and get the stuff done, they then could matriculate at the college. And that's been an incredible program. So certainly there were times when some folks tried to get beyond the silo, but it hasn't been overwhelmingly accomplished, sadly. Now, recently, places like Amherst College got a chunk of money to make available for scholarships, and they've been doing even more work in the area and in the neighborhood. Similar, in a sense, to the Baldwin program, but even more widespread because there were many, many more resources. Millions of dollars were made available by some individuals. So I think that there has been some effort, and I'd like to hope that there'll be even more, because again, you're right, there is a tendency to be very insulated. Not much brings you across the border. There have been some interesting cultural developments, like Gateway in Holyoke, and sort of working to attract folks to performances and so forth. And some of that's worked. I know a fair number of folks who have been able to enjoy things that are being done. A little less so in Springfield, but occasionally there's some stuff,
Well, recently you and I went to the Springfield Jazz and Roots Festival.
Yes,
and
exactly.
We in particular went for one particular, Delfeo Marsalis and his orchestra. But there, over the course of the 2 days,
thousands of people.
Yeah.
And it was obviously very, very well advertised in the five college area generally.
Yeah.
And some of the people who were connected to it are connected to the five colleges. They weren't necessarily the main leaders, but there are five college connections to it.
Right.
Yeah. So there are those kinds of events, and there are Kari and Jerry, who you may know. Kari is a well-known DJ and producer in the area. He's on the National Public Radio station. He was one of the MCs at the Jazz and Roots Festival, but his parentage, his mother was an African-American woman. His father was a well-known and highly regarded Kenyan politician. When Mom moved back here, one of the things that she did was she created this historical forum, and for years she would invite some extraordinary speakers in, And that sort of bridged the sort of silo separation between the 5 colleges. She did one heck of a job. And there have been other instances too, but it hadn't been easy, because of the politics, because of the class differences, because all those things are things that have to be dealt with and overcome to bring about the sort of connections that. But there have been people who've worked on it,
Yeah.
There really have been.
No, I think that's one of the benefits of living here in the Pioneer Valley is that we get to experience this.
Yeah.
And see it firsthand.
Yeah.
And then, unfortunately, we read the headlines about what's going on in other places.
And the rest of the,
which are, quite disappointing
Yeah.
at this point, considering that, we're in the year 2023.
Yeah.
But I mean, you've had quite the career. You've been retired now for quite a while.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
and obviously you're still here.
Mm-hmm.
This area is, the Pioneer Valley is your home.
Yep. Absolutely.
And like myself, I've been other places, but I end up back here quite frequently because it is a comfortable area.
Yeah.
For a lot of people, not
Sure.
just Black people or Hispanic people.
Sure.
Or LGBTQ people.
Yeah.
It's a good mixture. It's an interesting mixture in
Yeah.
the area of all the types of people who
Yeah.
actually live here.
No, I couldn't agree more. You're right. You and I, this might or might not be interesting to people who watch or listen to this, meet together with a group of friends a couple times a week. And there are anywhere from 6 to 10 or 11 of us at any point. And it's a highly varied group, varied in terms of who the folks are and what their backgrounds are and what the conversation is like, from a person who's a major part of the NPR radio to, former doctors to people like you who have had all kinds of experiences running clubs, and one guy who was a groupie or roadie for just a ton of musical folks. And I don't know if I would find that kind of mix particularly easy to connect to anywhere else.
Right.
And it wasn't hard, There's friends, and then friends of friends, and friends of friends, and it's been sustaining in many ways.
Right.
It keeps the social part of me innervated.
Yeah.
And interested, and just knowing you got good friends.
Right.
And the diversity, as I say, while it's not racial diversity, because this is Northampton after all, still it's remarkably diverse in terms of who's there and what we do and the support you can get. So yeah, this is home.
Yeah.
This is home.
Yeah, Pioneer Valley Life. That's the name of the show.
Yeah.
And we've had a conversation today about life in the Pioneer Valley.
Yeah.
So I'd like to thank you very much for being my guest.
It's been a pleasure being here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.